ऑडियो आ रहा है?
टाटा भैया जी।
ऑडियो आ रहा है?
नो सर, नो सर, वीडियो नहीं आ रही।
अभी आ रहा है ऑडियो?
नो यस सर, आ रही। ऑडियो आ रही है? मेरी नहीं आ रही। नो सॉरी, वीडियो आ रही है।
साउंड नहीं आ रहा?
ऑडियो नहीं। नो सर, साउंड नहीं आ रहा।
Wait.
That we've typically baked our bread the day after we shape it.
Okay.
This bread is 2 days after we shaped it, and it's so that we can have Sunday off. We'll do things like projects in the garden, that kind of thing. That's our off time. Really anything that sort of breathes a little bit of life back into us that's not baking. We put a lot of effort into what we do in the bakery. A lot of it's very precise. A lot of it's sort of mentally taxing. And even though we have a lot of passion around it, you've got to find fuel for that passion. For me, at least, I think this is different for everybody. I like to be fueled with just new knowledge or new learning. So our latest kick is the garden. We're working on that. And that basically translates into, well, I'm working on the garden now and I'm going to learn something cool from nature, probably, and that's going to cause some changes or some inspiration in the bakery. And so in that way, we sort of recycle energy. Because if the only thing you're doing, you know, the common thing out there that people say is if you're starting a business, all you can really do is work on the business. And to some extent that's true, especially in the beginning. We wanted to build a garden years ago, but we're just kind of getting after it now, because the last few years have been all about the bakery. What I noticed in the past season, though, is that I really needed to get some external stimulus in order to keep having energy to do the same routines better and better and better over time. You know, the motivation has changed over time. At the beginning, it was good enough for me to know that people would come on Saturday, even though we were working 24 hours, and just buy the stuff we baked. And that was the fuel that kept us going and going. Now we know people are going to come on Saturday. You know, they come every Saturday. I can't get them away. They just keep coming back, which is great. But we need some other fuel in order to keep all of these people happy, because if we're not fed, we don't have anything to give when feeding others. Quite literally with food. The issue with 2 days versus 1 is figuring out when to scale this bread so that it doesn't overproof, even in the fridge. I'm touching it right now, and it seems to still have a decent amount of spring, a decent amount of life to it. I'm hoping that it turns out just a little bit better than last Monday, where it had seemingly a little less life, and then I couldn't quite get the aesthetic. So the bread was delicious, but it didn't have kind of our iconic artistic flair at the end, because it didn't have enough energy still in the loaf. If you look at this dough, it's like a ball of energy, but it's a finite ball of energy. So the starter in here is fermented, and we've tried to manage the temperature so that when it hits the oven, it still has a burst and lets the bread rise. If you catch it at the wrong time, the bread will rise, but it won't rise quite as far. It'll be a little flatter. And so then when I'm trying to get that ear, that baker's ear, which you can see in this bread that's been left over here, this ear, it won't happen. Some of the fancy designs that we put in at the end, you know, these are meant to be kind of the reflection of all the work that we've put on the inside of the loaf that you can't really see. So we spend a little time with these guys before we just pop in the oven. So I've got them on boards, and if you were in just about any other bakery, for the most part, you know, bakers that are working at volume at hundreds of loaves a day aren't going to do much more than just put a slash through all these really quick. 30 seconds in the oven, done, move on. I've got 4 ovens to load. By the time I load the 4th one, I'll be back to number 1, and I can keep going. We add a layer here. So I'm going to spray all these down. And by no means am I the best person at this job anymore. There was a time where I was, and on Mondays it's me, because I need practice too. I can't just be doing business administration all the time. I've got to get in here and practice my craft, but I have hired somebody who works this role and does a far better job. She's literally an artist. Like if she wasn't doing this, I imagine she'd be doing some artwork. All these stencils she's made over time. So I bought her some stencil paper, and she's just been making these cool stencils over time. So this is just a simple proof stencil. Always replace your razor blades. These things don't cost very much. I don't even know if one razor blade costs a penny. We buy them by like the 1,000 pack for a few dollars. And after one round of baking loaves, the blade does dull. So I'm just gonna rotate this one. I can probably get one more life out of it. This is called a Wire Monkey LOM. You can look these guys up online, Wire Monkey. They decided to get into the business of making a more functional LOM for bakers. This is the traditional LOM that you'll find on Amazon. What's annoying is that once I get going with this, the razor blade's gonna fall off in a few loaves, so it's not very practical. The design of those LOMs doesn't prevent the baker from using the back of the blade. And the thing about these blades is if you catch the back of the blade, it will actually tear up your score. You really only want to be using the front part of the blade. So this score opens up the loaf, creates that ear. It allows the loaf to rise upward. What happens if you don't score is as the bread rises in the oven, it will find the weak point in the loaf, which often is on the sides, and burst out the weak point. So if you don't do this cut, you'll find that your loaves look like T's instead of like a nice oval. So I've got these done. I'm gonna put them back on the rack momentarily. Doesn't seem like where they would go, but we're gonna load 2 ovens at once instead of 1. And the key to pretty much all kitchen work is batching. So rather than loading 1 oven at a time, I'm batching this activity. By doing so, I'm gonna just be a tad more efficient. You might be wondering what this magic dust is that I'm putting on the boards. It's kind of cool because it's actually the stuff that was not included in the flour that we got milled for us. So it's still that same flour blend that we're using in our bread, but it's the 15% that's been sifted out. So it's mostly wheat bran. We use primarily a type 85 flour. What that means is it's like 85% of the full wheat berry is intact. All parts of the wheat berry are there, but the millers have sifted out the biggest chunks of bran, that outer coating of the wheat berry. Now, what does bran do in nature? It actually prevents the germ of the wheat berry from germinating until the right season. So it acts as like a moisture barrier, so that moisture can't get in too quickly as that wheat has now tumbled onto the ground and is turning into new seed for the next crop of wheat. So eventually water does get in, but we're actually using bran in the same exact way. It's in a powdered form now, but we're using it as a barrier between the board and the wet dough that we're putting on it, so we can slide the dough into the oven without it sticking to the board. The result of not using bran is really ugly, and I don't want to share it with you. We've been there, we've done that. A lot of people use cornmeal, and I don't know about you, but I just don't need another use for corn. I think there's plenty of uses for corn. I'd rather stick with wheat and not introduce some sort of corn into this wheat product. We're actually able to get that bran as a byproduct from our mill, because they sift it out of the flour that they produce for us, and then they don't know what to do with it. It's like good for some animal food, but we can actually use it right here. So we just request that they make separate bags of bran for us, and as we need it, we use it. We end up using a lot of powdered forms of flour that help with moisture. Flour really does trap moisture pretty well. That's why people dust their dough on the tabletop so it doesn't get too wet and sticky. The rice flour that we're using on top of these loaves has a similar overall function to that, except rice flour traps moisture differently than wheat flour does. Just creates, it doesn't dust off. So if I used regular flour here on top, the stencil wouldn't really hold. So right after we remove it from the oven, it would just kind of dust off. But for whatever reason, rice flour has more of a sticky effect. We also use rice flour on our bread forms. So rice flour is what's preventing the dough from sticking to the bannetons when it's living in the bannetons. We could use bran for that as well. We choose to use rice flour because of its color, so that we don't end up with like this weird layer of brown all around the loaf that people then ask us what that is. Just the way that things are right now, we already once in a while get new questions from new customers. One person in particular bought a multigrain loaf from us and stuck it in her freezer for a week. No problems there. She took it out, a week later and thawed the loaf. But I don't think she regularly bought artisan bread, and she began to get concerned with things that she was observing on her bread that came directly out of the freezer. So she noticed that the bread had a white top, and it was actually the rice flour that I was dusting on it the week before when I was baking it. But she had sort of forgotten that that was there when she bought the loaf and was terrified that that might be mold coming out of the freezer. And so I explained to her that it was rice flour, and she was satisfied, but then she turned her loaf over and she noticed that there was like a coating of almost a yellowish, brownish, orangish thing on the bottom. It's like, oh, that's the bran, and that's so that it doesn't stick to the baking boards. But just another note to the sort of artisan nature of our role in a bakery like this. You don't see the bran residue in an industrial baked product because typically baking in a baking pan, not directly on a stone. And furthermore, the larger the bakery is, the more likely that the oven that they're using, even if they're baking artisan loaves, has something called a loader. It's this big conveyor type thing that protrudes from the oven. You put loaves on it, and you just slide it in and slide it out. No bran needed. And so the larger the bakery is that you bake from, the less likely you're going to see any kind of a moisture residue, moisture barrier residue at the bottom of your loaf. This functional score is going to give us a nice ear. The ear is going to match the shape of the curve that I cut, so you can manipulate how your ear looks based on how you score. Some bakers score at a slightly different set of angles, and so each oven load is 12 loaves. When we first bought the bakery, we had this pizza oven that didn't have steam injection. It wasn't as wide as this one, so it could fit 2 boards, not one, so it could fit 8 loaves at a time. Since it wasn't a bread oven, it also wasn't sealed. So as you were baking, oh, and the thermostats were busted. And the wiring was all messed up and crazy over the course of, you know, however many 20 years of its life, people tinkering with it. So the effect on us was that we could bake 8 loaves in an entire hour. And the entire time we had to stand at the oven. So you're probably doing something similar at home to what we were doing with our original oven. You can either put a pan of water in the oven that will evaporate. I personally prefer that method now that I know a little more, but I didn't know that in the beginning, and so we took like a weed sprayer that you would find at Home Depot, sanitized it, cleaned it all out, filled it with water, and we would spray that water into the hot oven to generate steam, and then hope that it didn't all evaporate out of all the pores in the oven. We definitely got ashy looking loaves. So you can look at this loaf and see all the shine kind of in that crust layer. And it's sort of present in each one, a little bit of a sheen on top. Without steam, you end up getting something that's sort of dull and ashy. There's no shine to it. Final round, I release the steam. These are little dampers that they're like a little valve at the back of the oven that lets air either get trapped in the oven when it's closed or flow freely out to the hood when it's open. I've released that air, which releases the steam that was trapped in that oven chamber. And without the steam, now the crust can develop and gain more color. When the steam's there, it sort of like protects the crust from actually browning too quickly, while also providing that like deep color to your loaf. So without the steam, you get this kind of ashy, almost gross looking brown. And with the steam, you get this gradient shine that starts from like a light brown and goes all the way to the darkest acceptable shade of brown before burnt. Pretty happy with those. I would say that overall, we did a lot better on the 2-day proof this week than last week. We got nice ears on most of these. And you can tell just by the shape of the loaf that the fermentation was solid. The loaf is kind of even, and it's just a risen form of the shape that we tried to give it when putting them together. If a loaf is too tall or too flat, a lot of people confuse when they're first starting that, oh, they get a really nice ear, a really sharp ear, a really tall loaf. But oftentimes the middle is really, really tall and it contracts the sides. You get like a really uneven rise. And that's actually a sign of it being underproofed. I like the timing of this one a little bit better. And the funny thing is that the loaves are slightly darker. So to you, this may be burnt. I don't know. Everybody's got a different perception of color. And I sort of wonder how much this sort of mimics our whitewashing in society in general. We just tend to seem to think that lighter is better. But when it comes to bread, I disagree. And I really like to push the boundaries of even our customers that are accustomed to like a really, really light brown, doughy bread. I don't get it. Because if I let the whole loaf look like this really light portion here, then when I go to poke it, there's no crust. It's not there. And I'm not really going for that. So there are a lot of people that want their loaf that color. And I guess for them, it's probably best to stick with the sandwich bread until you figure out the intention of this artisan bread. Remember that this is essentially like the child of that of that bread that we bought 100 years ago, that really, really large month-long loaf that came in black because it baked so long to get to done. This is the modern version of that. And so it's not going to be too light. This is the light part of my oven. So, and here's what I mean. Like, I can't send this out into the world. You might look at it and like it, but see how that's just really spongy still? It's not a crust. If you don't like it, well, fortunately there's a lot of bread out there in the world. We're just trying to make it the way we like it, really, and we hope to share what we like with the world and hope that enough people like it too.
ओके स्टूडेंट्स, कुछ समझ में आया? Students, I am audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, समझ में आया कुछ?
Yes,
How
sir.
to make a bread? किसी को नहीं समझ में आया? ओके, किसी को नहीं समझ में आया? वीडियो देखा सबने?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
तो समझ में आया मतलब
आपने ब्रेड देखा? ब्रेड्स का शेप क्या है? साइज कैसा है?
yes, sir.
जी, बाहर यही ब्रेड्स चलती हैं। वहां पर ऐसे ही ब्रेड्स होते हैं, इन्हीं को कट करके यूज किया जाता है खाने के लिए, जहाँ कोई भी डिश बनाने के लिए। सो अभी नेक्स्ट प्रैक्टिकल में हम बनाएंगे कुछ, ठीक है, सभी ऑनलाइन, और प्रेजेंटेशन करके पिक्चर्स सेंड करेंगे, ठीक है।
सर वो आपने कोई रेसिपी अभी सेंड करनी है?
क्या?
आपने बोला था ना मैं आपको रेसिपीज फॉरवर्ड कर देता हूँ,
हाँ,
तो वो आप सेंड
रेसिपीज,
करिए।
हाँ, जो भी हमने बनाना होगा वो रेसिपीज मैं आपको एडवांस में फॉरवर्ड कर दूंगा, ठीक है।
ओके सर, यस।
ठीक है, आज के लिए इतना ही, मिलते हैं नेक्स्ट क्लास में। ओके,
थैंक यू सर।
थैंक यू,
Thank you, sir.
वेलकम।
Thank you, sir.
ये मीटिंग खत्म कर।